This Octo Final debate between ANU1 on the F and USU3 on the knee. Unless your presentations or anything, I'm ready to get in the way.
Mr. Speaker, we think that living in cities, particularly when your nation is developing, is a very important way to access economic and political rights. We think that Greenbelt laws act as an artificial restriction on the housing supply within those cities, which effectively prices whole markets of poor people out of that market for housing, out of that market for jobs, and out of the ability to exercise political power in any meaningful way within those states. We think that that is appalling and something that we wish to change in today's debate. I've got 5 issues in substantive. Firstly, what are Greenbelt regulations and what are we proposing? Secondly, how we think that these inflate the costs of living in a city and the harms of that. Thirdly, how Greenbelt regulations are abused. Fourthly, how we facilitate development in developing nations. And fifthly, how our model won't affect the environment in any meaningful way. So firstly, what are Greenbelt regulations and what do we propose? We recognise that Greenbelt regulations are a decision passed by a government or council to restrict the growth of that city artificially. So they'll draw a boundary around that city and say that development cannot occur beyond that certain point. They're not designed for the protection of the environment because what we see is that grazing of animals and farming is allowed in these areas. It's just not the development of the city itself. But we think that even if they were designed for the protection of that environment, they're not particularly useful because they create strips of land and they're often used by farmers and used by people who live near that area, that they allow their pets and animals to run around in that area and degrade the environment in that way. There is no assessment of environmental worth when creating a greenbelt. What they are not is national parks, they are not heritage protections, and they are not things like zoning laws. We think that those things are acceptable, just not deciding to artificially limit the growth of that city for no reason. What we propose is that we would abolish these laws restricting the development and growth of the cities, and what we would do in return is we'd let the market decide the most efficient allocation of housing. So if people want to live in a city or on the outskirts of that city, we're perfectly happy to allow them to live there. Second argument, how do we think that Greenbelt restrictions inflate the costs of living in a city? And what we recognise is that they're an artificial restriction on the housing supply within that city. So it says that if you cannot live within a certain defined geographic area, you cannot build any houses and that is no longer part of the city. It means that it's harder to enter parts of the city to work as a result because you are stuck in a rural area because you can't build on the outskirts of that city, putting your resources closer to the market and closer to higher pricing. What we think that these restrictions do is when limiting the housing supply, we see that they amount to pricing those poor people out of the market for housing in those big cities because it artificially inflates that cost because of the restriction of supply. Why do we think that's bad? A few reasons. Firstly, because where you live is a really important personal choice that we think should be protected for people. Why is this? Because it affects so many of your other choices and opportunities. So it affects your ability to attend political rallies, it affects your ability to get education, it affects your ability to just go out and enjoy living in a city, a right so many people across the world take for granted. So we think for that reason it restricts a very important choice. Secondly, it oppresses that choice of poor people relative to the middle class and upper classes artificially, because we recognise that poor people do want to live in those cities, and what we're saying is because of laws passed by parliaments controlled by those classes of people, we're not going to allow that moving into what would be the cheapest areas of that city. Thirdly, it oppresses financial and education outcomes. Why is that? Because schooling is harder to come by in rural areas, Mr. Speaker. It's harder for states to provide infrastructure to rural areas than it is to provide infrastructure to the outskirts of KL, Mr. Speaker. We think that it is harder to provide schools, it is harder to get your produce to the market, and it is harder to participate in that market for labour in a way that people in the city do. That essentially means that poor people who can't move to the city constantly have lower income because they can't get those opportunities in the same way as we can. We think, moreover, it restricts the political power of those poor people in a way that makes it hard for them to ever change their outcomes. Why is that? Because when you're centralised in an area with people who think like you, it is easier to organise and it is easier to get rallies and political representation. When you're spread out across rural areas, you are stuck with what the city wants you to do and what the people in the city are saying. People who would move into these outskirts of KL, for example, we think they would be by and large people who are poorer and have less opportunities and would be, because of their new proximity and newfound sense of identity, can politically organise in a more effective way. We don't think that building up in cities is going to help in the same way as getting rid of these greenbelt regulations. Why is that? We think firstly that building up is not viable in the long term because it's contingent on vested political interests wanting to avoid that building up in their city. What we see is, by and large, in wealthy cities, they don't allow the building up because people in Paris don't want their views to be ruined. People in wealthy suburbs in KL like to live in an area with few people, where they can get sole access to those resources and opportunities. Secondly, though, we think that you need a certain amount of infrastructure in that area before you can build up. And once you've already built that city, it is harder to build more and more highways through that area. But what you do see when that happens, and you just build more and more highways, is you get things like ghettos. So you see people live in areas where it's extremely unlivable for those people, and they can't access the same opportunities in that same successful way. So we don't think building up has the same outcomes. We think, moreover, in my third argument, greenbelt regulations are abused because in developing countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, there is a centralisation of political power amongst the wealthy in those communities. So when you want to, so they abuse those laws to protect their own interests. Why is that? Because they don't want their housing prices to drop as more people can gain access to that market. So they try to create belts around their suburbs which stop it from getting developed. Why is that? Why is that bad? Because it protects vested power interests and it prices out the poor. This cannot be changed, as it is inherently an arbitrary call what is going to be a greenbelt protected area and what is not. So we think that it requires no environmental assessment, and political persuasion stops people from changing that. Fourthly, why do we think we facilitate development in developing nations? Because what we think is that developing nations need urbanisation as an important way to aid that development. Why? Because it's part of the transition from agricultural economies. So people move into the city and they're less likely to do that, and they might work in a factory producing things which can be sold to foreign markets. Secondly, though, we think that people can get the best paid jobs in a way that they otherwise can't afford. So when people would be paid more if they worked in the city, but they can't afford to even enter that labour market because of the barriers to entry, that means that wages are restricted, and that stops those people from helping that development of that nation. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we don't think that will harm the developed environment in any meaningful way. Why is that? Because you can still protect environmental areas, provided you assess them on the validity of that protection. So we think that national parks can be protected and things like that. What we think is that when you pass those meaningful protection laws, you're going to see a better form of protection because it's based on the actual environmental work. But what these laws don't do is they don't protect those environmental areas because they allow farms and they allow people to access those areas and degrade that environment. Mr. Speaker, we think that people should be able to access all the opportunities of cities. We're proud to propose.